AIDS is nothing to laugh at. But for those of us who were at the beginning and lived through the AIDS-HIV epidemic, there was a publication called Strip AIDS, which, well, it wasn't about being funny, but it did put AIDS into a comic context. One of the founders is our guest today, Robert Triptow. How are you?
I'm fine.
I remember when Strip AIDS came out. It was 1988. I was writing for The Advocate.
That's right.
I interviewed you and the co-founder, Trina.
Co-editor.
Co-editor.
Yeah.
Trina.
She was one of three co-editors. Bill Sienkiewicz was a mainstream cartoonist in the East Coast who brought in a lot of famous comics, superhero comics artists into Strip AIDS USA.
Yeah, and I remember interviewing you and Trina, and there was an article in The Advocate, and at the time thinking, wow, what a weird idea, a comic strip about AIDS, but it became a huge educational tool.
But that was the point of it. It wasn't meant to be funny, ever. It was meant to, there was so much homophobia already, and then there was AIDS-ophobia. And that was what I was trying to defeat, or at least work against, especially amongst comics readers who tended to, the cliche was they were all teenage boys, which was true, but they were teenage boys into their 40s. And they tended to keep teenage boy thinking, especially about gay people at that time. The world's changed since then, a lot. I mean, you couldn't go to a comics convention and have a gay presence in those days, and now you can't get away from it.
Yeah. I mean, North Star, wasn't he the first ever openly gay comic book hero?
Superhero, yeah.
Yeah. Well, from Strip AIDS to now has been quite a career for you. I mistakenly said that you were the self-proclaimed last underground cartoonist, but someone else called you that.
I was at a convention and somebody asked me if I were an alternative cartoonist or an underground cartoonist, and Lee Mars was standing right there, and she's one of the queens of underground cartooning, and she said, well, you lived in the Haight, didn't you? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, did you starve? And I said, oh, there's so many times I went not knowing where my next meal was coming from during that period. She says, you're the last of the underground cartoonists. So somebody was videotaping that, and the next thing I knew, it was all over the internet.
Right.
And I decided, well, somebody has to be that, so it might as well be me.
Yeah. Did you ever think that you would have this incredible body of work that, in a very real sense, both your art and your life have chronicled the LGBT rights movement? I mean, you moved from Salt Lake City to San Francisco, as I recall, on Halloween 1977, when it was still on Polk Street. So you knew and met Harvey Milk. You knew the people that were instrumental in our struggle.
Well, that's actually true. I moved to San Francisco the week before Harvey Milk was elected into office. I was hired at The Advocate 2 weeks later and worked for David Goodstein, the publisher of The Advocate. So all of the events of the movie Milk, I witnessed firsthand, and I knew those people. I also saw a lot of behind-the-scenes behavior in it. And I'd only come out of the closet 6 months before, so it was kind of a shock, culture shock in a big way. But it's interesting, cartooning, gay comics, which is sort of a limited title for LGBTQ, etc. cartooning.
Yeah, and gay comics, C-O-M-I-X.
Because it was considered an underground then. But if you were to read every issue in sequence, you would actually see a pretty pertinent history of the gay movement from the 70s until now. Because before gay comics, we basically had just pornographic comics. Gay Heartthrobs was a gay underground that was all sex.
Right.
Gay comics was kind of militantly not sex. We wanted
militantly not sex.
Well, our attitude was we wanted to tell stories about our lives, and it's with as much humor as we could find, because nobody wins an argument, but you can seduce people with humor. That was my attitude anyway, and I think it was fairly successful. And it started out with a lot of things that became part of the gay evolution. Sitcoms, you know, there are gay sitcoms within gay comics long before Will and Grace. There was Leonard and Larry. It started out with kind of sad coming out stories and angry militantism. Pardon me for mangling the language. I'm a cartoonist, after all. And then it went into a lot of humor about the gay community, lots of fun at the expense of the disco scene.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading, I believe the comic strip was called Poppers.
Poppers.
With, you know, there was this big, beautiful, blonde, dumb beefcake.
Named Billy.
Billy.
Yes, that was Jerry Mills, one of the most brilliant gay cartoonists of all time, did Poppers for Skin magazines in L.A. But it's so popular that to this day people ask about it, and I'm actually putting together a collection of Poppers strips. I'm peddling them all around town these days.
Yeah. So from being the last underground gay you know, how did you afford to get those early editions out? I mean, now are you actually making money?
I made almost as much money as I spent on coffee last year from cartooning. It's you know, you mentioned it's a career, and I've heard people call it a career too, but it's not a career. It's basically a glorified hobby.
You don't consider it an art form?
Oh, I consider it an art form, but it's still kind of a glorified hobby. You know, I didn't ever do any of it for money, ever. I didn't even do it, when I started publishing, I didn't even do it for personal acclaim or ego fulfillment. I did it because there was an epidemic going on around us, and I was in the position to say something or at least lighten things up. And you know, my motivation for Strip Age USA and editing gay comics in the 80s was mostly to make the world a little bit less grim during a very grim period. And it's sort of funny, I kind of stopped doing it after the last of my close friends died of AIDS. I kind of lost my motivation for a few years there, and then had to pick up the pen again for, you know, for different reasons years later.
You know, I jokingly said in the tease that maybe during the Trump administration we will have a golden age of cartooning, because I was speaking with Summerlee Kasher, who's the executive director of the Cartoon Art Museum, and we were talking about politics and cartooning, and she said, well, cartooning is always political. And I said, well, you know, from the right or the left? She said, well, usually all good political cartooning is from the left because conservatives haven't found out how to be funny. I mean, do you think that's true? Are we about to go into a golden age of cartooning because of the new administration?
It's possible as long as we still have freedom of the press. I remember.
Are you really concerned about that?
Well, there's some actions being taken by the administration that indicate they're going to wage war on the press. As a defensive measure, if nothing else. But I think they have a long way to go before they can get every smartass on the planet to shut up, and that's mostly cartoonists. I remember when George W. Bush became president and 9/11 happened, the very next day there were all these people saying, it's the end of irony, no more humor, and of course that didn't prove to be true either. In fact, it seemed to be even more room for satire and humor, because the more seriously anybody takes themselves, the more of a target they make of themselves.
Well, you know, you actually led to my next question. Political cartooning can be dangerous. I mean, Charlie Weibo.
Oh, yes.
You know, two questions for you. Is political cartooning dangerous? And two, can you go too far? I mean, after all the sympathy that was generated by Charlie Weibo, they've come out with some, you know, I mean, boy, if their goal is to be edgy and piss people off, they succeed. I mean, can you cross the line as an underground cartoonist?
The line is always changing. Underground cartooning started out as drug-fueled cartooning, you know, hippie-era cartooning, that later turned into, let's break every taboo we can think of cartooning. But it got pretty tired pretty fast. And, you know, I did a little bit of that at the beginning, but I moved on to the other form of alternative cartooning, which was to tell stories of people's lives that weren't being told in mainstream press, and especially mainstream cartooning. The best example of that being the excellent work done by the women cartoonists, Trina Robbins and Roberta Gregory and Mary Wings, and all those incredible feminists who did women's comics, sort of set the pace for gay comics later on. And it was more, you know, we're not going to win an argument, but here's a story about my life, and you can either agree with it or not. And that's kind of all we ever can do.
Right. Well, I remember a wonderful lesbian cartoonist that we used to gather at some of our little groups of, I think you came to some of them, BAM Gals, Bay Area Media Gays and Lesbians. It was a potluck of local gay and lesbian journalists that became the precursor to the National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association. And Chris Kovic would come, and someone who now has raised, I think you could say, cartooning and comics to a whole nother level, Alison Bechtel.
Alison.
I mean, did you ever think that we would have a Tony Award-winning musical based on a really out there lesbian comic strip?
No, I never thought that. But had it been suggested to me, I would have thought Alison would have been the one to do it, because she's always been more professional in some ways. A lot of us treat it like I said, it's more of a glorified hobby, but with Alison, it was always her career. I don't know her very well, but I'm so full of admiration for her. I saw her 2 years ago in New York at the Queers and Cartooning Conference there, and couldn't even get a minute of her time because she was everybody's darling. Fun Home had just opened up on Broadway, and she was nominated for all these awards. And you know, it was kind of an eye-opener for me, thinking, well, these little scrawlings we do on paper are little fantasies that are very personal sometimes and have sometimes very little to do with the real world, but hopefully a lot more to do. You know, it can actually lead to places.
Yeah.
And for me, it was an eye-opener, too, because I was in New York with all these fans of queer cartooning, and it kind of opened my eyes to the impact that my own work had done in gay comics and Strip Age USA and other publications. Because when you're a cartoonist, you're basically working like a monk in the night by yourself. And you're cackling at your own little jokes when you first do it, and then you're sick of them by the time you finish the story. And by the time the cartoon's in print, you don't ever want to see it again.
Yeah.
But it takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
I forgot the train of what I was saying, but
That's all right.
it's such a thankless job in a way that, so I got to New York, and suddenly I'm surrounded by people who had read my comics all these years. And you know, for a couple of decades, I thought, well, this has been a wasted effort. Maybe 2,000 people ever read it at most. It's more popular now than it was when we were doing it.
Yeah, yeah. We've only got about a minute left, but I want to ask you about the cartoonists that inspire you. And I want to go back to that idea of, are we coming now into, because of not only the administration, but because now the internet allows comics to be distributed and this sort of art to be distributed more,
Right.
and the idea that Alison Bechdel has now, you know, kind of opened up
Mainstream doors
for this sort of very gay cartooning.
and very personal cartooning, and also kind of taboo breaking still, because humor is oftentimes based on the unexpected or misfortune and what people don't want, you know, think they're going to read. It's there, and it's very upsetting sometimes. I don't know. There's the second Queers in Cartooning Conference is taking place here in San Francisco on April 14th and 15th, and a lot of those people are coming here for that, and it's going to be an ongoing discussion. As for the people who've influenced me or impressed me, way at the top of my list are Howard Cruz, Jerry Mills, who we talked about earlier, Allison, Trina Robbins, one of my heroines in life. And it's funny, though, how it changes, because when I was younger, my heroes in cartooning were different people. Jules Pfeiffer, who was the first one I ever saw, I still love his work. R. Crumb, who I've become more disenchanted with as time has gone by. But then others who I realized meant more to me, like John Stanley, who did Little Lulu, means more to me now than when I was a kid. And Gilbert Shelton, who did the Freak Brothers, I think was the best of the underground cartoonists. And it does change, because you know, a reader changes, and that's the way it should be.
Right.
You know, I don't believe in fandom where you get locked into one thing and that's all you ever do.
Thanks, Robert.
Yeah,
We've been speaking with Robert Triptow, underground cartoonist. Next up, our conversation with Jim McCullough, founding executive director of the Friends of the San Francisco Film Commission. We'll be speaking about the first ever Robin Williams Award for Excellence in Entertainment.